Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for our impromptu study session. Just a reminder, there is a study guide on Canvas, and it looks like this. Let's go ahead and get started. There are two main learning targets that you will be tested on. The first is explaining the main causes of World War I. Obviously, understanding those four main factors, as well as understanding how they contributed to the start of the war. Our second learning target is evaluating the goals of the Treaty of Versailles and its impact on world politics and economies. I really want you to understand how the Treaty of Versailles was created, who are the voices that were heard, who are the voices that were not heard, and what were the main factors of the Treaty of Versailles. So just a couple things about this test. First of all, it's going to be 15 questions, all multiple choice. It is mostly stimulus-based. So out of those 15, I believe 12 of them are based on primary source analysis, which means that you're going to have a primary source that you're going to read, and then you'll be answering about 3 questions based on that primary source. You will have 35 minutes to complete the test. A couple hints about primary source type of tests. One is that you really want to make sure you read the questions even before you touch the source. So it'll say like this source is for questions 1 through 3. So again, don't read the source, go and read the 3 questions. This will prime your brain so you know what you're supposed to look for and you know what you're supposed to be understanding. Then, as you read the primary source, please make sure you summarize and understand what is the source saying. The very first step to being able to analyze a primary source is reading comprehension. Do you know what this source is about? 3, ask for help if you don't know what a word means. Now, these sources are not necessarily meant for freshmen in high school. They may have been written for politicians in the 1900s. And so I really want you to not be afraid to ask if you don't know what a word means. Now, obviously, if you raise your hand and ask me who's Archduke Franz Ferdinand, well, then that's a different situation. And lastly, it's important to understand the context of these sources, which is why we're going to start by really understanding those key terms, because you won't be able to understand the significance of the sources you're reading if you don't know the history behind them. Let's jump in. All right, so why were the Balkans full of turmoil? The Balkans were full of turmoil because there were a lot of nationalist movements that were happening at the time. The Ottoman and Austrian empires were weak, and therefore that region in between them was really unstable. What does MAIN stand for? Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Think of an example of each. Now, I actually want you to try and do this. Pausing this video and trying to brainstorm would be a good start. Okay, hopefully you paused, but as we all know, I don't know if you did or not. So a couple of things you might want to consider for the rise of militarism is how militaries start building during times of peace to be larger than we've ever seen before. We start to see militaries used as a way to deter enemies. So if your military is so big, so bad, well, no one's going to want to attack you. We also see an arms race form of trying to figure out which military is the strongest, which military is the biggest, and remember that this is an impossible goal. For alliances, we want to think about how an attack on one is an attack on all. We also remember that there were secret alliances. Not all alliances were known, and therefore there becomes this web of alliances throughout all of Europe. I for imperialism. This one was that kind of the one that we should have been more obvious, but it's this idea that we are going to be attacking for and competing, for the same resources. There aren't infinity amount of colonies. So once most colonies are taken up, there becomes a competition to see who's going to have more or less colonies. And remember, we talked about how Germany is losing when it comes to gaining imperialistic strength. And then lastly, nationalism, this rise of feeling like your country is the best and therefore your country is entitled to anything and everything it desires. And this feeling of jingoism, meaning aggressive foreign policy to take what you feel is yours, as well as extreme hate of other nations. Why was Serbia angry at the Austrian-Hungarian Empire? Hint, which country were they fighting over? The country they're fighting over, oh, hello. The country they are fighting over is Bosnia. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire had just annexed Bosnia into their empire, and the Serbians were really upset because they desired to unite with Bosnia so that all Slavic people could be together. Oops. No, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who killed him. Why is this significant? So, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the future leader of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and he goes to visit Bosnia, do a little parade, show off his strength. However, this is extremely insulting to the Serbians, who do not want Archduke Franz Ferdinand to be in the nation in the first place. So this is where the Black Hand, which is a terrorist / hero, depending on what side of the war you fall, decide that they're going to take matters into their own hand and assassinate him. Specifically, the man who does it is Gavrilo Princip, that 19-year-old teenager who ultimately kind of gets lucky and sees Archduke Franz Ferdinand while he's at a cafe. Hi. Hello. And so why is this significant is because once Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are assassinated, the wheels of the war start turning. That pressure that has been building in Europe, well, now it's ready to explode. What was the blank check and why is this significant? The blank check is a check that Germany gives Austria-Hungary following the assassination. And it is basically whatever Austria needs, Germany will provide. If they want to go to war, they'll go to war. If they need money, resources, a military, Germany's going to have their back. And this is significant because a lot of historians point to this blank check as Germany trying to egg on the war. Do it, go to war, I'm going to have your back. It's also significant because without this type of support, Austria may not have been as quick to try and go to war. So in response to this blank check, Austria sends its ultimatum. So who is it sent to? Well, it's sent to the Serbia's government. And what was their response? Serbia ignores the ultimatum. And why? Is because they know that they've got Russia to have their back because Russia and Serbia are allies. What are the three main countries in the Central Powers? That would be Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Four main countries in the Allies, that would be France, UK, Russia, and the United States. Now, there are more on both sides, but those are just the ones that we really focused on. Where is the Eastern and Western Front? The Eastern Front is on the Russian border, whereas the Western Front is on the French border. What was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and who were the countries involved? What were the two big terms? So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is the treaty that will pull Russia out of this conflict, will pull Russia out of World War I. And so who are the countries involved? It's Russia along with all of the Central Powers, okay? So Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all signed this treaty to get Russia out of the conflict. And what were the two big terms? Well, peace, right? Because Russia's out of the war, so that's very good for Russia. But in exchange, Russia has to give Germany 25% of its land. Why did Russia sign the treaty? Well, this is because at this point, Lenin has taken power in Russia, and Russia is now fighting its own civil war. How did the Allies feel about Russia pulling out of the war? The Allies were really frustrated with Russia. They felt like, well, now that Russia's out of the war, Germany can put all of their attention on the Western Front. And so this is a really big threat for the Allies. And we start to see some resentment building. For example, Russia is not included in the Treaty of Versailles, nor are they included in the League of Nations. And a part of the reason is because they've already signed a treaty, so the Allies don't feel like they need to be in these negotiations. And as for the League of Nations, they don't really want Russia to be a part of the League of Nations. And to be fair, Russia at this point in time is still fighting in their civil war, so isn't really that interested in being a part of this group. What was the purpose of Wilson's 14 points? Why were they rejected? Remember that Wilson comes into these peace talks thinking that he is going to try and build everlasting peace. So his 14 points are all about reconciliation. How can we bring these nations back together, build up these relationships so that no more global conflict happens? And they are largely rejected, except for one, because the Allies don't want reconciliation. The Allies want to punish the Central Powers. The Allies want to make the Central Powers regret the decisions that they made. And spoiler alert, the only one they actually accept is the League of Nations. So what's the purpose of the League of Nations and who proposed the League? So the purpose of the League of Nations was to create an intergovernmental body that would have everlasting peace, meaning this government body would deal with future conflicts. So instead of ultimatums and blank checks being sent, the countries would be able to talk it out, would be able to cool their tempers, come together and try and reach a diplomatic relation. And then who proposed the League? Well, that would be Woodrow Wilson of the United States, which again is kind of ironic because the United States rejects the League of Nations and the treaty because the United States government at the time does not want to be involved in future European conflicts. Connect the League with one main cause. So I think you can make an argument for any of these main causes, but for me, I specifically would connect the League with alliances because that's really what they're doing. They're trying to reconfigure alliances and they're trying to have a different type of alliance, one that isn't really based on us versus them, but one that is based on how can we work together to create peace. What is total war? Total war is what happens at every home front throughout the war. And this is when a country's economy is redirected to fit all of the needs of the war. So the example I gave in class is that if there used to be a toaster factory, well, that toaster factory is now going to be created into a factory that creates gun cartridges. And so the government is really involved when total war occurs because it's the government that is telling companies what to build, how to build, all that kind of stuff. What was the sinking of the Lusitania? That was that cruise ship that was going from England to the United States and then back to Europe. And it was supposed to be this cruise ship with just civilians, but it was sunk by German U-boats. But remember, it's not really all that it seems to be, considering that the Lusitania had cartridges of weapons on there. And so this is one of those things where Germany points to say, hey, United States, you're not really being a neutral country, considering you are clearly supporting one of our enemies, the Allies. What was the Zimmermann telegram? The Zimmermann telegram was that intercepted telegram that Germany sent Mexico to encourage Mexico to fight against the United States. If you remember, we talked about why they would do this, and the idea is because this is a distractor. The Germans want the United States to be able to focus on their own war rather than focusing and supporting the Allies in World War I. Okay, that is it. That is all I have for you today. I'm trying to think if I missed any major parts of it, but I don't believe I did. If you have any questions, please send me an email, but I hope this helps. Good luck, you guys.